Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, boni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you're joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Christ Tompkins. He is here to talk to us about his really important book. It's called Raising LGBTQ Allies, a parent's guide to changing the messages from the playground. Before we invite Chris into the studio for this very important conversation, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Jennifer Swanson and her really fantastic book, Astronauts and Aquanauts, Space and the Ocean. If you don't think they go together, think again. Join us on an amazing journey as we go up into space with astronauts and dive deep down into the ocean with aquanauts to explore the far-off places of our planet and the solar system. You might just be surprised at how similar the domains of astronauts and aquanauts really are. Presented by the Dean of all things STEM and STEAM, Jennifer Swanson, this awesome book will give you a peek inside how real astronauts and aquanauts do their job and may even inspire you to become one yourself. Jennifer Swanson's Astronauts and Aquanauts can be purchased at most online booksellers and bookstores, and you can also ask for it at your local library. Be sure to check out Jennifer's website, jenniferswansonbooks.com, for activities and videos that go with the book. Finally, take a listen to the Solve It for Kids podcast, a podcast that I am so very happy that I was a part of and remain a part of. The Solve It for Kids podcast is the science podcast for curious and creative kids and their families. Joining us right now from Los Angeles in California, our guest today is here to talk about a really important book, I think. It's not a book that we're likely to sit down and read with our kids, but it is a book that parents should be reading because the message inside is so very, very important. Please welcome to the show the author of Raising LGBTQ Allies, Christ Tompkins. Hey, Chris, welcome to the Reading with Your Kids podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's really good to be here.
I'm excited to have you on. I think that this is an important subject. No matter how you might feel personally about LGBTQ issues, whether you have religious feelings, the one thing that we've said consistently here on the show is there's no debate when it comes to showing everybody respect and love and making them feel welcome. And I think that's the whole point of this book.
Right. It is. Absolutely. And I agree with that for sure as well.
So tell us, it's interesting how you were inspired to write this book. Share that with us, please.
Yeah. So kind of the quick version is that back in 2015, I was at a family function and my nephew, who was 6 at the time, ran over to me and asked, his version. Oftentimes kids, they have the thought his version of whispering is talking out loud. So he ran over to me and whispered, but out loud, "Uncle Chris, is she your girlfriend?" to this woman that was sitting next to me. And I just remember kind of the moment was almost like time stood still and I was just noticing everyone's reactions. And cause I was really I was caught off guard because I just assumed that he knew that I was gay. And so I started to realize maybe his parents aren't having that, conversation. And so I started to ask around to different parents, people who I knew who had kids. And I was getting some pretty surprising responses, like, "Oh, I didn't know if they were old enough," or "I don't know what to say," or, and so what I share in the book is that I knew that I was gay when I was 6. And so I was the same age as my nephew. And so I was hearing all of these people talk about he's not old enough, but yet I was remembering that I was old enough to know that about myself when I was his age. So that's kind of what was the impetus of the book.
That's really fascinating that you knew that you were gay. I mean, I'm just trying to understand that, because when I was 6, about all I wanted to do was roll around in the mud and pick my nose, and you know, the idea of who I'd be attracted to, I don't remember that entering into my mind.
Yeah. I get that question a lot, and it's something that I write about in the book. And what I talk about is that, you know, one of the things that I really hope to highlight in my book with parents, especially today, is because I do think that times are changing. And so when we think of homophobia, transphobia, you know, we often think of bullying or outright like verbal words or messages. But what I'm really talking about is we live in a heteronormative society. And so children, when they're born into a predominantly nuclear family that has a male and a female, or the movies they watch, or the messages are all over that there's no real, kids are just kind of learning and observing around them. And so the messages are dominant that, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people talk about little kids having crushes. Oh, he has a crush on her. Or, oh, you know, my nephew, when he was around like 2 years old, he would get really quiet when one of my cousins who's female would come over to the house, and everyone would say, oh my gosh, he has a crush on, you know, my cousin, so-and-so. So to answer your question is that when I say that I knew that I was gay, oftentimes we put our adult constructs of what that means. Mm-hmm. And so right now you're an adult, I'm an adult. And so you're trying to understand from adult's perspective, how could a kid know that he's gay? Because you're associating those, you know, being gay from an adult. Whereas for me as a kid, I was noticing that there was something about me that wasn't the same as a lot of the other boys that I noticed on the playground. And so I talk about in the book what I refer to as messages from the playground. And it's an analogy that I use to describe the dominant societal beliefs that we pick up. So as a kid, I was very observant. So I was noticing boys and girls and people talk about crushes and seeing in movies and seeing my own parents, who's a man and a woman. And I was just observing that I didn't feel that same way. There was something about me that was, at the time, I didn't necessarily know that it was gay, but I knew that I was not the same as a lot of the other boys that I knew.
Okay. All right. Yeah. It's, you know, and I'm almost 100 years old. So, you know, the way, and I came from a human service background. I was a social worker and work with kids, and the way the world, or at least the way human services and counselors look at the gay and lesbian issues. And I know in your book you refer to homosexuality as a slur, and you don't like to use the word. So I'm trying to, you know, not be offensive. But I know, you know, what I was taught about, you know, dealing with somebody who identified as gay or lesbian has changed. You know, when I first started social work, the thought was, oh, this is a choice that someone makes, and it's okay for them to make that choice. And right. And it was listed in some medical, I don't know the initial, DSM.
DSM, yeah.
Yeah, the DSM as being some sort of a disorder. And right. I know that has changed a great deal. Right. They don't always send out the memo like, hey, this is changing, this is why it's changing. Right. We've right. discovered these different things.
Right. Yeah, no, you bring up good points, and I address a lot of them in the book. And my first chapter, I talk about the history of the DSM. You know, you mentioned the term or the use of homosexuality, and it's not that it's a slur, it's that the history of the word mm-hmm. was used for a long time as a way of denigrating LGBTQ, specifically lesbian and gay people. And so it's not that the term is a slur. It's just that what I talk about in the book is that when it's used outside of a clinical context, mm-hmm. that's when it can be sometimes offensive for people because it has that history. And I give that breakdown. And one of the things that I really think is important, because you mentioned the DSM right now we have the DSM-5, is that homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. And oftentimes it's pointed to 1974 as when it fell out of the DSM. Right now it's the DSM-5, like I mentioned, but before it was the DSM, I think 3. And homosexuality fell out of the DSM in 1974, but that's not entirely accurate. It wasn't until 1985 that it entirely came out, because it was still considered an ego dystonic disorder. What that means is that if someone was going to a therapist and they were upset because, they didn't want to be gay, or maybe they had some shame around being gay, if that therapist wasn't aware of heteronormativity and how oppression works, is that outside oppression creates internalized oppression. And so dominant outside messages create inside a person negative beliefs. And so I really unpack that, because I think that's really important to really look at when it comes to where we're at today. And just from like an observational perspective, because I think words are really important, is that whenever we talk about the LGBTQ community, oftentimes we use LGBTQ issues. Okay. And so even in the conversation that we've had this morning, just as just a point of reference, issues are often, these are, gay and lesbian issues or transgender issues. And so what I also talk about in the book is how words are really important when it comes to talking about certain groups of people. And so using words like issues are kind of rooted in that history of the DSM-5 or the DSM.
Yeah. So what is, because like I said, I'm an old guy, so I'm really trying hard to be respectful in my language.
Yes.
What's the best way for somebody like me to, a better term instead of.
Yeah. No, thank you, Jed. And I really appreciate your question. I appreciate even having this conversation. And what I don't want is that the book, and I actually talk about this in the book, is that this isn't about being so hyper vigilant about what we say that we fear even talking about it. And, or we stumble through, I don't want to offend someone, so I don't know what to say, so I'm just not going to say anything. And that's not what I want. I want us to be able to have an open conversation and to be able to talk about these things. And so what I invite readers to consider in the book is that instead of issues, we could say matters pertaining to the LGBTQ community. So for myself personally, I really try to intentionally use matters because I think that LGBTQ people matter. And so I try to, really insert matters versus issues. Or, when I talk about, because I often go to schools and share my coming out story. I volunteer with an organization called PFLAG. And so I'll go to schools and share my coming out story. And so when people ask me, well, how did, similar to yourself, or how did you know that you were gay when you were 6? And I really try to not describe myself as being different, because I often think of children in the schools that I'm going to visit, and some of them may or may not be out of the closet, or they may be on the journey of coming to terms with their sexuality or gender identity. And so if they hear me use words like, well, I was different, kids, when they're young, they want to be a part of the group. And so that's oftentimes where the closet comes, is that a young child doesn't want to be different. And so, maybe teenagers, that's another story. But, when you're young, you really want to be a part of something. And so I try to be really mindful with my language, especially around young kids, because I think it really influences how they feel about themselves. And that's really what the book is too, is that it's raising LGBTQ allies. So it's not necessarily just for, parents who have LGBTQ kids. It's for kids in general, so that they can start seeing LGBTQ people in a way that is normal versus different.
Yeah. So when we're talking about raising LGBTQ allies, what does that mean? What does that look like? What does an ally look like in the way that they behave on the playground?
Yeah. An ally, it's really, so I've been teaching social emotional learning for 6 years. And one of the classes that we teach is about bullying and what bullying looks like. And I talk about this in the book, but most of us, when we think of bullying, we think of the bully and then the person who's getting bullied. What in this class and what we really have conversations about with young people are that there are more people involved in that scenario. There's the bystander. There are people who contribute, and there are also people who can stand up for the person who's getting bullied. And that person standing up for the person who's getting bullied is really important. And so my hope with the book is that by inviting parents and caregivers and teachers and mental health practitioners to have conversations with all young people, because all young people have a journey of discovering who they are, that when we can invite kids to consider that there are other ways to grow up and to be in the world, then that helps them see kids in a more, that's not different. That's not, bad. That was one of the things that I was so surprised by my own family, is that I come from a big family and there are like 20 to 30 young kids. And so just statistically speaking, because my book really started out as a letter that I wrote my family. Mm-hmm. And I was inviting my family to consider, if we're not talking about this in our families right now, there are kids in our family who could be LGBTQ. And so by us not talking about it, they're intuiting, like they're picking up the messages from the playground, the subconscious beliefs that, we don't talk about this. It must be shameful. It must be bad. It must be different. And so to be an ally, again, I talk about in the book is that it's not enough to just support someone who's LGBTQ, or it's not enough to just say, I have a gay best friend, or, I love, people who are LGBTQ. We actually have to take, I call active allyship, where we take action. And that means having conversation. That means being mindful of the words that we use. That means when we talk to our kids about school, that we include same-sex examples, so that the dominant heteronormative messages aren't only what they're receiving, that we actually start to insert kind of a new way of talking to our kids and incorporating ways in which they can see themselves.
Interesting. How do we start a conversation that's natural, with a 6 or a 7-year-old, that addresses the kind of things and topics that you're mentioning?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I just had this conversation, a similar one yesterday, and my measure that I invite parents and caregivers to consider is that when children are old enough to start asking questions, that's a pretty good indicator that it's, a good time to start incorporating the conversation and having the conversation. So for instance, my nephew, who is 6, if he's old enough to ask me if that was my girlfriend, he's perfectly old enough to know why I wouldn't have one. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of, to me, a natural way of having the conversation. And I completely understand that, a lot of parents that I know, they want to be helpful. And that's what I'm so grateful to have this book and to have these conversations. And as much as they want to be helpful, they may not know how. And so they may have some discomfort. Like I said before, they don't want to offend. They don't want to get it wrong. And what I invite readers to consider is that parenting is no easy feat, and we're going to get it wrong, and we're going to stumble, and that's totally okay. Because what I invite readers to consider is that wherever there's a rupture, there's an opportunity for repair. And it's in the repair that we get to develop a stronger relationship with the young person in our life. And so we can ask questions, we can have conversations just by virtue of asking them how their day was and listening what they tell us. I try to, with my nieces and nephews, after my nephew asked that question, I started to get them books for gifts. Mm-hmm. Instead of toys. I started to get them books. And And that way I was kind of, because I live in California, I was still, my family's in Arizona, I was still kind of having the conversation without necessarily me needing to be there all the time.
And I appreciate the patience that you're showing with me, because like I said, I'm an old, dumb old man, and I raised my kids to be respectful, and I am very proud of the fact that they are allies right now.
Yes.
And they're great kids. But I think the one thing that hopefully, if parents parents, authors, whoever's listening to this, they can only take one thing away from this conversation, is the fact that we're having a conversation. We're having a respectful conversation, and I'm asking questions that are difficult for me to ask sometimes because I feel awkward, and you're answering the questions in a respectful way. And I think when we finally, end this and say goodbye to one another, I don't think we're going to walk away from each other saying, well, that guy's a jerk.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I'm definitely not going to walk away thinking that. I appreciate you saying that because, I will say that one of my hopes with the book is that it takes a lot of energy to constantly be the person who's educating. And so one of my hopes with the book is that it's not the responsibility of the child to teach the parent who they are. It's really up to the parents to learn who the child is. And so my hope with the book is I'm an adult. I've been an LGBTQ advocate since I came out of the closet. And so that's a very long time. And so I don't mind, me personally, taking time and having conversations. What I hope, though, is that we can take the onus off young children and really kind of put it on the parents and caregivers and youth serving professionals to really learn and also unlearn. And so that we're learning who the kids are versus kind of putting it on the kids to teach us who they are. And if there was one message, I'm sure maybe you've talked to other authors and there's like that elevator, like if you were to summarize your book in kind of like a quick version, one of the messages that I really hope that parents and caregivers and people who read my book, it's talk to your kids, talk to your kids, have conversations, and don't allow fear of getting it wrong to prevent you from saying something.
Yeah. And, I was mentioning to Chris before the show that I've been doing educational magic shows for years. It's a theme that schools have wanted me to address most often over the last 20 years, is this issue of bullying. And our understanding of bullying has grown and evolved so much. At first, schools wanted me to go in there and cheerlead, say no to bullying, you know. And I quickly realized in my research that it's more than this. And it's, we need to do more than just say, don't bully others. We need to tell the kids who are in the middle, the vast majority of kids who aren't being bullied, who aren't being the bully, but are seeing it happen. They're the kids who can actually make changes by standing up, supporting each other, being an ally of whoever, not just LGBTQ people, but people from different races, different cultures, different languages.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Bullying is it's nuanced. And I think everyone can, one of my chapters I specifically have a whole section on what if your kid is the bully. And I talk about that, because I think that we all can relate to feeling not necessarily bullied, but because bullying can look very different. And I also talk about that. Like you said, it's nuanced. It's not enough to say, don't bully. We have to really look at what's going on. I don't think any person wakes up in the morning and feels so good about themselves that they say, I'm going to try and make someone else feel bad purposely today. And so we really have to look at, what's going on? Like what's going on in the child's home? What's going on with the person themselves? What's going on in the class that this is actually happening? What's going on with the teacher? Like it's very nuanced. And so to even have the conversation, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, I know we just scratched the surface.
Yes.
Because in your book, there's fantastic research. There's a lot there. I would absolutely encourage parents, and especially we have a lot of teachers who listen. I really encourage teachers to pick this book up. There's a lot of knowledge there in the book. It's a great place to start. This is a really important issue, not just for people who are LGBTQ, not just for people who have somebody in their families. It's an issue for all of us. Because if we raise our kids to be allies of everyone, to raise them to be respectful, caring, and inclusive of everybody, we're going to have a much better world.
Yes.
Chris, where can people find out more about Raising LGBTQ Allies and find out more about you?
Yeah, thank you. The book is sold wherever books are sold. If they go to Roman.com, that's my publisher's website, they can get the book there. Amazon, most independent bookstores, I think, in like communities across the country. So if they want to support their local bookstore. And then as far as myself, my website is aroadtriptolove.com, and that's all one word, aroadtriptolove.com.
Wow.
And I'm really grateful to be here because that was one of my hopes is that, it's back to school, and I hope that more teachers and caregivers and youth serving professionals can really, really help create LGBTQ allies in the classroom.
Yeah, very important. We've been speaking to the author of Raising LGBTQ Allies, Chris Tompkins. Hey, Chris, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. I appreciate it.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Philip Reed. He'll be joining us from the United Kingdom to celebrate Cookie Koala and the Problem. I wonder what it could be. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, we would love to help you tell the world all about it. Please be sure to go to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, click on the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page, and scroll on down to learn about how you can be a guest, learn about our Certified Great Read program, and also learn how you can take advantage of our monthly promotion programs. Really, really powerful and popular. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Chris, I want to start by thanking our guest, Chris Tompkins. Please be sure to check out Raising LGBTQ Allies, a parent's guide to changing the messages from the playground. We also want to thank our sponsor, Jennifer Swanson, JenniferSwansonBooks.com. Be sure to check out all of the great books from our Dean of all things STEM and STEAM, Jennifer Swanson. Especially take a look at her Astronauts, Aquanauts. It is a certified great read. In fact, it was one of the first certified great reads. Also want to thank my team, Alejandro Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Michael Murphy. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.